بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So this is lesson number 33, the 33rd lesson in our series on the book Al-Uboodiyyah, the book on servitude by Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah. And in the previous lesson, basically the previous lesson can be summarized in the last sentence that we mentioned in the previous lesson. The last sentence was the statement of Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, فَهُوَ دَائِمًا مُفْتَقِرٌ إِلَى حَقِيقَةِ إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. Right, so this was the last sentence that we looked at in the previous lesson, and it summarized the contents of the previous lesson. So basically Ibn Taymiyyah is saying here that the servant is constantly in need of the reality of the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal, you alone do we worship, and from you alone do we seek assistance. Right? So if you recall in the previous lesson, he mentioned that the heart is in need of Allah Azza wa Jal in two ways. The first way is that it is in need of worship, right, as an actual quality of the heart. The heart has been created to worship, right? And secondly, it is in need of Allah because it is in need of the assistance in the ways and means, right? In the route to worshipping Allah. This is the nature of the heart. And so without these two things, it cannot reach serenity, peace, satisfaction, tranquility, being content. Right? This is the nature of the heart. And so that's why the statement that we finished on was this very statement, that the servant is always in need of the reality of this statement, which is you alone do we worship, and from you alone do we seek assistance. Okay, so we're going to continue elaborating upon that meaning, right? So we're continuing the discussion now. We're developing it a bit further, and so today's lesson starts from this point. Now here there's a lengthy sentence or a paragraph that Ibn Taymiyyah mentions. So I'm going to read it, and it's a bit of a, it's a long, complex sentence. So I'll read it first, and then we can come back and explain what it means. So he says, فإنه لو أعين على حصول ما يحبه ويطلبه ويشتهي ويريده ولم يحصل له عبادته لله بحيث يكون هو غاية مراده ونهاية مقصوده وهو المحبوب له بالقصد الأول وكل ما سواه إنما يحبه لأجله لا يحب شيئا لذاته إلا الله. فمتى لم يحصل له هذا لم يكن قد حقق حقيقة لا إله إلا الله ولا حقق التوحيد والعبودية والمحبة وكان فيه من النقص والعيب بل من الألم والحسرة والعذاب بحسب ذلك. Right, so in this sentence he says about the servant, if the servant was aided by Allah to acquire those things which he loves and which he pursues and which he desires and wants, right? So in other words here, that you can have a servant and he has desires and wants and needs as it relates to worldly affairs. So Allah Azza wa Jal aids him, gives him assistance to acquire these things, and if at the same time he is not aided or he does not acquire the worship of Allah, right? In the sense that Allah is the one whom he is seeking, the one whom he is desiring, the one who is, the end goal for him, who he's seeking, and Allah is the one who is the beloved. He's supposed to be the beloved to the first degree, and bearing in mind that everything besides Allah is only loved for the sake of Allah. Only Allah is the one who is loved in and of himself. He's the only being that is loved for his essence, right? Everything else besides him is not loved for itself, for its essence. It's loved for the sake of Allah, right? So in other words, because it's a long sentence, right? So in other words, if you find that a servant is being aided to acquire those things that he wants and desires, like from the worldly affairs, right? He's getting these things, he's got the desire for them, and then he's aided in them. But at the same time, he is not being, he's not acquiring the worship of Allah, right? That he's not fulfilling what amounts to the worship of Allah, and Allah is not like his ultimate goal and his primary goal. And yet we know that Allah is the one who is the beloved, the one who is loved in and of himself, and everything else is only loved as a consequence of loving Allah, right? So when such a person does not attain and obtain this, like this worship of Allah, this servitude to Allah, then he has not actualized the statement La ilaha illallah, right? He has not actualized that statement. He's not basically put that statement into practice, and he's not fulfilling it as it should be. And nor has he actualized Tawheed, nor Uboodiyyah, which is servitude to Allah, nor Al-Mahabba, which is love of Allah, right? So in other words, he hasn't actually fulfilled all of these things: the kalima, Tawheed, servitude to Allah, Uboodiyyah, and Al-Mahabba. And he has within him such deficiency and blameworthiness, and also pain and loss and punishment to the extent of that, right? So in other words, here what is happening here is that sometimes you have many of the servants of Allah Azza wa Jal, and in their day-to-day life you see that they have pursuits, they have goals, they have wants which they pursue. And so Allah Azza wa Jal, he aids them in some of those things. They get those things, right? But at the same time, we don't see that he is acquiring and actualizing worship and servitude to Allah, given that Allah is the one who is loved in and of himself, and is the one who is sought, and is the one who is pursued, and is the one who is, right? And so if you find this happening in a servant, then this is a sign and an evidence that he hasn't truly actualized the kalima, and nor Tawheed, and nor Uboodiyyah, and nor the love of Allah, because the love of Allah is the foundation of Uboodiyyah, right? And Uboodiyyah is Tawheed, right? And so therefore this means that he has deficiency with him, such deficiency. That deficiency is such that he's blameworthy, and it will also bring him loss and ruin and punishment as well, because of this deficiency. So that's the sentence. And then Shaykh al-Fawzan, hafidhahullah, he comments upon this sentence or this passage. And so Shaykh al-Fawzan says that when we see that a person isn't acquiring and actualizing this Uboodiyyah, this servitude to Allah, in that Allah is the one who he loves the most, more than anything else, and so therefore there's now a desire for him to be a slave to Allah and to worship him, and so on and so forth. Then when he doesn't actualize all of this, and at the same time Allah is aiding him in the affairs of the world, Allah is aiding him and that's why you see many people, and many Muslims in fact, they're very successful in the worldly affairs, they are very good big businessmen, they've acquired lots of money, lots of wealth, lots of, houses, cars, and they're very successful. But we see that they don't really, so Allah's aiding them in that, but we don't see with them the uboodiyyah and servitude to Allah. And, they are just pursuing the worldly affairs. Then, just because they've been aided by Allah in those things, that will not help them in anything. Right? It will not help them in anything. But as for the one who is aided by Allah in his worship, in worshipping Him, and likewise the means, the ways and means, like there's ibadah, and then there's i'ana, Allah aids, right? So when Allah aids a servant in giving him the support in worshipping Allah, this is the person who is فَهَذَا هُوَ السَّعِيدُ فِي الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ الْمُطْمَئِنُ الْوَاثِقُ مِنْ رَبِّهِ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى. This is the one who is the happy person in this life and the next, the one who is tranquil, the one who is firm, this is the happy person. And he continues, the servant does not obtain ease and tranquility except by the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But as for when he is not given success in worshipping Allah alone, this person will never be tranquil, will never be at ease, and he has lost the very foundation of tranquility and ease, right? Because this is the very foundation of tranquility and ease. And as for the world, the dunya, the world is such a thing that you can never ever be tranquil with it or through it. And for that reason, the believer isn't a person who is inclined to the world in the sense that it's his primary objective, because the world, it ends, the world will come to an end, it's the material things therein will come to an end. Your companions, your aiders, your helpers, and even like your soldiers if you are a ruler, right, all of those instruments around you, all of those will end as well. All of those will end as well. And nothing will remain except what is between the servant and his Lord. That's the only thing that will remain, what is between the servant and his Lord. And this is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is the one that the hearts worship and love, and they taste pleasure through His obedience, and they have intimacy, like a type of friendship by being near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then all of these are the benefits and the fruits of being in servitude to Allah Azza wa Jal. These things are the ones that bring tranquility and serenity and so on and so forth. And then we continue in the same paragraph where Ibn Taymiyyah said, he made the point that only Allah is loved in and of Himself, like, as a being. And everything else besides Him, it is only loved as a consequence of loving Allah Azza wa Jal. On this point, Shaykh al-Fawzan says that nothing is loved for its essence, meaning in and of itself, except Allah. And everything besides Allah is loved for the sake of Allah. Right? So if there's someone else, for example, if there's someone else from the servants of Allah, for example, the prophets, the messengers, the righteous people, your parents and other people who are loved, they are loved for the sake of Allah. They are loved for the sake of Allah, because loving them is something that Allah loves and is pleased with. So you love them. Well, obviously there's different types of love. So for example, with your parents and blood relatives, there is a love which is tabi'i, it's natural. So obviously you're going to love them. And that's something that Allah has put in you to do that. And then outside of that, there are other people that you love, the believers, the prophets, messengers, whatever. You love them because, for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal. But those things besides Allah are not loved in and of themselves. Only Allah is loved in and of Himself for His essence. And that's because we find that everything besides Allah, what we find from the people, is that the love of those things often is because of a need, because of a motive, because of an objective, because of a... And that's why the relationships that exist among the creation, they are not pure relationships, right? Unless they are for the sake of Allah, right? Anything that's for the sake of Allah, that's a pure relationship. But what you find often is that even, for example, like, with your friends, families, and things like that, the love is often because you've got a need of that person. Why is it that you are befriending that person, wanting to spend time with that person, want to be in the company with that person? Well, often you find people have like motives and needs and wants that they don't always reveal, right? That person is going to be useful to me. I can, get such and such benefit from him, or assistance, or facilitate my life by way of the, assistance I can get from this guy. So let me just keep, friendship with him and be nice to him, and because there's benefits that are going to accrue to me, right? This often happens. You find it with perhaps like with neighbors or things like that, when you're not fulfilling the right of the neighbor because of the sake of Allah, but because of some of the need that you might have, or so these type of things exist in all worldly relationships, until even with parents, some people you find with the parents, they keep relations because there's a material benefit there, and not because this is my parent, I love him or her for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal, whatever. But there's a, so these types of things, and the same often you find like people, you might have business people that like each other, it's purely because of business, not because of anything else. Right? This is the nature of all, relationships and types of love which involve others besides Allah. They can be pure if it is for the sake of Allah alone, but they can also be tainted and impure when there's worldly needs, right? There's desires, there's matami' and hawa'ij, there's wants and needs, and there's dependent and things like that. So the point being from this, the point being made here is that only Allah Azza wa Jal is loved in and of himself, or his essence, and as for everything besides him, it is only loved because it's a consequence of loving Allah Azza wa Jal. But often those types of things which are loved besides Allah, they can be tainted, those relationships, with objectives, goals, desires, motives, which are not always apparent. And people don't really make them apparent. So then Shaykh al-Fawzan continues, and he goes on to make mention of it. There's a very nice paragraph here, in fact, that Shaykh al-Fawzan mentioned. So I'll read through it and translate it and explain. So he says, وَإِذَا فَقَدَ الْعَبْدُ الطُّمْأَنِينَ وَالْأُنْسِ بِاللَّهِ فَإِنَّهُ لَمْ يُحَقِّقْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. So as a consequence of all of this discussion, when a servant, he loses being tranquil with Allah and having this friendship with Allah, right? Because this is what you are supposed to achieve, right? By being in servitude to Allah, because the love of Allah is more than any other love. So therefore you are now in servitude to Allah. That servitude now brings you, it should bring you, if Allah is the one whom you're seeking, right, it should bring you this serenity and tranquility and friendship, right? If this is lost, if you don't find it, if you don't have it, and if you aren't tranquil and at ease and at peace and calm in your life, right, and you're free from all of those like anxieties and things like that, if you're not tranquil, then you haven't really actualized the reality of La ilaha illallah, right? And in fact here, also like sometimes you often come across people with like, this question always comes up about mental health issues, mental health problems, anxiety, stress, whatever. And a lot of the time people ask, how can we treat this? What is the medication? What is the nutrition? What is the this? What is the that? Can we go to this? Can we go to a non-Muslim, consultant, or there's a, is it consultant, or there's a counseling? counselor, things like that. And ultimately, all of these things always return back to, obviously it comes down to weakness in Iman, first and foremost, the weakness in Iman in Allah, His angels, His books, His messengers, al-Qada wal-Qadar, understanding al-Qada wal-Qadar as well, particularly, and the last day. There's a weakness in that knowledge there, because that firm foundation of Iman will make sure that when a believer, he encounters like trauma, like an emotional trauma or a difficult situation in his life, then that strong Iman should allow him to correctly frame and understand that particular trauma, right? And to see it in the right way, right? And the reason why mental illness arises is because that trauma or that shock or that experience that person has, it's wrongly framed in his mind, right? And he's unable to resolve it and think it through and resolve it, and for it to pass through his mind as something that's been resolved, right? And so therefore it sticks and lodges in his mind, and he can't get out of it or get over it, and so it stays in his mind. That trauma is there, and then all the other things start following on from it as well, right? So you keep thinking about it, and then the waswasa can come in, the whispering from the shayateen, and it becomes lodged in your mind, and you can't really process it and get it out of your system, right? So a lot of these things, like when you don't have al-tum'anina, al-raha, al-surur, al-ladha, these are like pleasure and serenity and calmness and tranquility, and you're content with life, and you're able to deal with things that come your way. It's because there's obviously multiple reasons. I mean, what I've mentioned here is just like the foundation of it all, which is a weakness in the pillars of Iman and the details of those pillars. Because obviously we know that everybody knows, belief in Allah, angels, books, messengers, al-Qada wal-Qadr, and the last day. Everybody has this knowledge, but it's because of a lack of the details, right? The specific details in all these things and how they affect a person in his personality, in his outlook. All of these have an effect upon you, right? Yawmul Qiyamah, there's going to be absolute justice. So if somebody has wronged you in this life, well, you trust in Allah, justice will be done. Right? You don't need to become angry and upset and, caught up in something. That gives you certainty that justice will be done, and the criminal or whoever it is will be brought to justice. Right? So there's no, right? So each of these pillars of Iman, Allah, the books, the messengers, the angels, and especially al-Qada wal-Qadar, right? Understanding al-Qada wal-Qadar, this is one of the very important things to understand that helps, with these types of things. So the point being that if you do not have tranquility, happiness, you are just miserable and unhappy and stress, anxiety, this, that, whatever, it's often because you've encountered certain things in your life, stressful things, trauma, emotional trauma, loss or whatever, and you've not responded to it in the right way upon firm Iman in Allah Azza wa Jal, and that's kind of lodged itself somewhere in your heart, in your mind, and it's not being taken out, right? And the way that it's taken out is by these kind of issues, by Iman, tawakkul, reliance, thinking it through, resolving it, framing it in the right way, and obviously counselling is part and parcel of this. You seek counselling from a Muslim, from a person of Tawheed, Sunnah Muslim, not from, because when you go to non-Muslim counsellors, it's just purely materialistic, it's just, there's no, I'm not saying that it can't be of benefit, but it's lacking the essence of the solution or the cure. So when the servant doesn't have at-tum'anina wal-unsi billah, فَإِنَّهُ لَمْ يُحَقِّقْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. When the servant does not have tranquility and happiness, then he has not actualized La ilaha illallah, meaning there's some deficiency there. Then he says, لأن معنى لا إله إلا الله, because the meaning of La ilaha illallah is لا معبود بحق إلا الله سبحانه وتعالى. There is no deity worshipped in truth except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? There is nothing that is worshipped in truth except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the meaning of ilah, what is the meaning of a deity, ilah? Its meaning is al-mahbub. Al-mahbub. We've already covered this before. Right? We said al-mahabba is the foundation of worship. And the word ilah, what is the meaning of ilah? Ilah is al-ma'bud, the one worshipped, al-mahbub, the one who is loved. You only worship the one who is loved. And Allah, al-ilah, ilah, is one who is mahbub, the one who is loved. Right? So worshipping Allah is that, as he says, وَعِبَادَةُ اللَّهِ هي التي يحصل بها الطمأنينة والراحة واللذة والسرور والصبر والاحتساب والثبات. Worshipping Allah is that by which tranquility, ease, like al-ladha, which means like delight, you taste the deliciousness of it, as-surur, happiness, as-sabr, patience, al-ihtisab, where you're able to anticipate reward, right, al-thabat, firmness, right? All these things are acquired by way of the worship of Allah. وَمَعْنَى لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ لَا مَعْبُودْ بِحَقٍّ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. So the meaning of La ilaha illallah is that nothing is worshipped in truth except Allah. In other words, only the worship of Allah is true. It is truth. If you worship an idol, that worship is false. If you worship a cat, that worship is false. If you worship a monkey, that worship is false. If you worship Isa alayhi salam, that worship is false. Right? That's futility. Only the worship of Allah is true, is haqq and sidq. It is true. And then he says, and every deity that is besides Allah, then worshipping it is futile. It is false. وَكُلُّ مَعْبُودٍ سِوَى اللَّهِ فَعِبَادَتُهُ بَاطِلَةٌ. Every deity worshipped besides Allah, then its worship is false. And this is because لأن هناك معبودات غير الله, there are many deities besides Allah, وآلهة غير الله, many deities besides Allah, ولكن كلها باطلة وكلها باطل وكلها حسرة على أصحابها. And these deities will be ruin and loss upon the ones who worship them. وكلها يوم القيامة يكون بينها وبين عابديها بغض وبراءة وتحسر كما ذكر الله ذلك. And so these things which are worshipped besides Allah on the Day of Judgment, those worshipped and the worshippers, there's going to be hatred between them. They're going to free themselves from each other, and there's going to be ruin and loss between them, right? So everything which is worshipped besides Allah Azza wa Jal, they will be in dispute, they will be arguing with their worshippers, and the worshippers will be arguing with those whom they worshipped. You are the ones who misguided us. That's what they're going to say. You misguided us. Oh Allah, multiply their punishment because they misguided us. And they're going to say, we are free from you, what you worshipped. We've got nothing to do with you. Right? So they're going to try and free themselves from those, and those are going to say, put the blame on those. Right? This debate and argument between the mushrik and the one whom they shared in Allah's worship, this is a reality that has been mentioned numerous times in the Quran. And وَأَنَّهُ يَلْعَنُ بَعْدُهُمْ بَعْدًا, and some of them will curse the others. They will say, oh Allah, curse them, because for misguiding them. Right? All of this is going to take place. And he continues and he says, فَكُلُّ هَذَا يَزُولُ وَلَا يَبْقَى إِلَّا اللَّهَ وَمَا أُرِيدَ بِهِ وَجْهُهُ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى. So all of this, everything else will cease and come to an end, and nothing will remain except Allah and whatever whatever was sought. His face was sought by way of it, right? Whatever his face was sought by way of it, only that will remain. Allah will remain, and whatever was for his face. Everything else from the dunya will perish. All material possessions, all your relationships, all between mother, father, father, mother, husband, wife, father, son, son, father, right? All intimate friendships, all that will come to an end, except what was for the sake of Allah, which obviously is the sincere and the righteous deeds. So he says, فَالْمُسْلِمْ يَعْرِفُ ذَلِكَ. The Muslim is the one who knows this. وَيَعْرِفُ ثَمْرَةَ الْعِبَادَةِ. A Muslim also knows the fruits of worship. فَالْعِبَادَةِ لَيْسَتْ عَادَةٌ مِنَ الْعَادَاتِ. Because worship isn't just like a habit. It's not like a tradition. It's not something that you just blindly أو تقليدا من التقاليد كما يقول الذين لا يجدون لذة العبادة ولا فائدتها. Right? So worship isn't just like it's like a custom or a tradition that you follow, or something that you blindly, like a tradition that you follow, which is said by some people. There are many people who think that ibadah is just like a ritual. You just go and you just ritually just do what you're supposed to do, like rote repetition, and that's all it is. These people see it like that, but this is not so. Rather, worship itself, بل العبادة نعمة عظيمة. Worship is actually a tremendous bounty. A believer actually finds tranquility by way of it in his life, right? So for example, when you pray, when you do dhikr, when you remember Allah, sit there, you remember Allah, His names, and tahleel, tahmeed, tasbih, whatever. And when you pray, when you make dua, and when you do, the act of worship, that actually brings you tranquility, pleasure, right? It's not just a ritual, rote repetition, as is claimed by people who basically find worship to be a burden, right? There are many, you find this among Muslims, it's just a burden for them. Jum'ah is a burden, the prayer is a burden. Like, this is like, it's a hardship. I've got to do it, and I'll do it to follow the traditions, but they don't actually find any love, they don't find any benefit or taste out of it, or tranquility out of it. Whereas the believer, he sees it as a tremendous bounty, and he actually finds actual tranquility from it or through it in his life. And then because of this, because ibadah has an actual, tangible, real benefit upon a person and his heart and his mind and his soul, and he actually benefits from it. It's not just a blind rote tradition that you follow without any meaning, right? Because you actually benefit from it. And obviously this is how, like, you see the atheists and people like that. They say, oh, these are you just blindly doing this prostration and bowing, meaningless, empty, of no benefit. It's just a tradition passed on that you're just blindly following, and but this is false, because we find, and in fact this goes back to the same point that we mentioned in the previous lessons, that you find that those who are the most pessimistic and the ones who take their lives the most are the atheists, the atheistic nations, where they don't have any belief in anything. Everything is just, it's like nihilism, which is the idea that everything's going to perish and there's nothing of meaning anyway. So, you might as well just go and do as you please and do as you want, and whatever gives you tranquility, whatever gives you peace, invent your own ideology, invent your own philosophy of life, and just pursue whatever is your truth, and right? So even if that means raping children and doing whatever, right? Then that's your that's your truth, and that's your whatever, and so what happens ultimately? They never get pleasure, satisfaction, serenity, calmness, and then when they realize that the life is just utterly, completely meaningless, right? And like we said before, that when they come to realize that, well, according to my belief, what I believe in, the materialism and Darwinism and all the rest of it, my life is as meaningful as the dog's feces on the floor. Right? There's no difference between the meaningfulness of either of these two things. A lot of these people, they sit there and they philosophically think about all of this, and when it hits them like, that's the truth, then many of them basically they enter into this utter pessimism, like you're very pessimistic about everything. Everything is negative, everything is this, everything is that. Right? And that's why when you look at these philosophers in history, like the great philosophers, the European philosophers, like your Nietzsche's and these people like that, who said God is dead and whatever, you find that they were the most miserable, despicable, unhappy, filthy, vile people on the face of this earth. Right? And so, whereas for us the believers, when we are worshipping Allah Azza wa Jal, this is something meaningful, it is the truth, and it brings you actual tangible benefit. Right? You actually benefit from worship, dhikr, dua, sabr, isti'ana, isti'adha, right? All of this actually brings you benefit, and that's why the people of the earth who are the strongest in facing the trials of life are the Muslims and the people of Tawheed. How many times have you seen, like we know from many narrations from the Salaf, like one of the companions, or from the Salaf, his son dies and he starts laughing, in acceptance of the decree of Allah Azza wa Jal, laughing out of the pleasure of the decree of Allah. You see earthquakes happening in Muslim countries, and people coming out and being, grateful to Allah Azza wa Jal in pleasure. You don't see this with any other nation, any other people, any other, So here, he says, بَلِ الْعِبَادَةِ نِعْمَةٌ عَظِيمَةٌ. Worship is a tremendous bounty. يَرْتَاحُ بِهَا الْمُؤْمِنِ فِي حَيَاتِهِ. A believer finds he's at ease and tranquil in his life by way of this worship. فَإِنْ أَصَابَتْهُ سَرَّاء شَكَرَ اللَّهِ. If some happiness or something good comes to him, he's grateful to Allah. وَإِنْ أَصَابَتْهُ ضَرَّاء صَبَرَ احْتِسَابًا لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ. And if any hardship afflicts him, then he is patient, expecting reward, doing it for the face of Allah and anticipating reward. And so therefore, the events and the downturns and the hardships and whatever happens they don't affect him like, the ones that come upon people. He's not really swayed or moved by those things, because he لأنه واثق بالله عز وجل وأنه لن يصيبه شيء إلا من صالحه, that he will not be afflicted by anything except for that which is for his benefit. Right? So believer knows and recognizes this, that he knows that nothing is going to come to him except that which is in his interest and which is for his benefit. And either it is to purify him of his sins, or it is to increase him in righteous deeds, or as a sign for him to make tawbah, so he makes tawbah. Right? So in other words, when a believer is faced with a calamity, he knows that this has come to me, and there's only three options for me. There's only three things for me. One, this is a chunk of my sins removed, alhamdulillah, or it is my righteous deeds increased because of my patience, or it is a notification for me to actually repent. Right? And he should be happy that it came to him now before Allah takes his soul. So the fact that this calamity has come to me and I'm not dead, this is a tremendous bounty for me to, it's a tanbih, it's like a notification from Allah that he should repent. So this is a tremendous little paragraph from Shaykh al-Fawzan, hafidhahullah ta'ala. And what we'll do, Inshallah, we'll stop at this point today, inshallah. We'll stop the lesson here and we'll continue with because the discussion continues on the same point on ibadah and isti'ana and making tawakkul upon Allah, seeking aid from Allah. This discussion continues. We'll leave it at this point and inshallah ta'ala we'll continue that in the next lesson. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.